If you wanted to join the most dangerous unit in the German army during World War I, you had to be unmarried. You volunteer for the most insane missions, you train harder than anyone else, and you actually pull off things that nobody thought were even possible. And then your own country thanks you by throwing you into a meat grinder until there's not a single one of you left. That is the story of the German Stormtroopers, and honestly, it's one of the darkest things I've come across. So let's set the stage first. When the war kicked off in August 1914, every army expected it to be short. Violent and intense, sure, but done within months. Over by Christmas, as they said. Nobody's plans even seriously considered the machine gun as something that might change how marching armies and open battles worked before. Now, there were some people warning that this was going to be at least 3 years of bloodshed, a long, exhausting war that would ruin every nation involved, but nobody listened. So as you know, those initial plans fell apart immediately. The French ran headfirst into a grotesque show of what modern weapons do to armies still fighting like it's the 19th century, with soldiers still wearing dark blue coats and bright red trousers that made them visible from a mile away. They also thought that advancing in dense, shoulder-to-shoulder formations straight into German positions defended by machine guns and pre-sighted artillery would somehow be the right tactic. So you're not surprised now that these tactics that were supposed to win the war in weeks produced the worst losses anyone had ever seen in human history. So what followed was the race to the sea, from September through November 1914, where both sides kept trying to get around the other's northern flank. Each time one army tried to extend his line, the other one matched it, because they had aerial reconnaissance for the first time, and could see the other side prepare the attack. And then the other side would then meet it, dig in, and then they were all stuck there in front of one another. And when the whole thing hit the English Channel at the Belgian coast, there was nowhere left to go. By late November, a continuous line of trenches and fortifications stretched for over 400 miles from the Channel all the way to the Swiss border. And now, it was time for the fun part, something that is absolutely the worst form of combat known to us: trench warfare. It was now a static front defended by machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery, where neither side could move without getting destroyed. New weapons gave a massive advantage to whoever was defending, and for some strange reason it took a while before either side fully understood that. Now, trenches were supposed to be temporary, just somewhere to sit until the next advance. But instead they became permanent, and they soon grew from simple ditches into elaborate underground systems with multiple trench lines, communication trenches connecting front to rear, dugouts, command posts, first aid stations, ammo stores, the whole shebang. The Germans figured out earlier than the Allies that this war wasn't ending anytime soon, so they made their positions as strong as they could. The Allies, on the other hand, tended to build shallower, more temporary positions, partly because they still secretly believed that trenches were just jumping off points for the next attack, and shouldn't be made too comfortable anyway. This sounds like a small difference, but it had enormous consequences for the war. So here's how every attack worked in 1915. And you need to understand this cycle because it's the entire reason the Stormtroopers were eventually created. To assault an enemy trench, you first had to suppress the defenders and destroy the barbed wire in front of the trench. That meant artillery bombardment. And as defenses got stronger, these bombardments got longer and heavier. Hours turned into days, and days turned into weeks of continuous shelling. The infamous British bombardment before the Somme in July 1916 lasted 8 full days, with roughly 1.5 million shells fired. But here's the problem. All of that shelling, even if it did destroy defenders and their positions, which was usually not the case, the shelling also destroyed the one thing the attackers needed the most: surprise. When you're hammering the same sector for days upon days, the enemy knows exactly when and where you're coming. They've got time to bring up reserves, prepare their counterattacks, position their guns, and on top of that, the bombardment also churned no man's land that your infantry now has to cross into a moonscape of craters, tangled wire, and deep mud. So your own preparation just made it really fun for your own men to get across quickly with all the equipment they need for fighting. Really fun. And those deep German dugouts I mentioned meant the defender survived the bombardment far better than anyone hoped for. The moment the artillery fire would shift to the next trench line, the surviving defenders rushed up from those deep shelters, set up their machine guns, and were ready to fire just as the attacking infantry made it about halfway across. And this happened over and over and over again. And even when the attacking side did make it across and captured the front trench, their problems were just starting. They're now exhausted, disorganized, pretty much battered on the way there, and cut off from their own side. The telephone wires back to the guns usually got cut, so runners sent back with messages are getting killed in all the smoke and the confusion. So the men who just took the trench are completely and utterly on their own. Meanwhile, the defenders have fresh reserves coming up from the rear. Counterattacks would hit within minutes or hours before the exhausted attackers could prepare their position, reverse the trench to face the other direction, and get new wire up. The counterattack throws them right back out, and the whole thing is back to square one, minus thousands of dead and wounded on both sides. The human cost of trying to break this deadlock was simply staggering, and it was this desperation that eventually gave birth to the Stormtroopers. Because against this background of mass slaughter for absolutely zero result, all the major armies started experimenting with something quite different. Small raiding parties. Instead of these massive frontal assaults with tens of thousands of men, why not just send small teams across to no man's land under cover of darkness or fog, and hit the enemy trench at one specific point? You kill sentries, grab a prisoner for interrogation, take out a machine gun post, snatch documents, or just keep the other side nervous and off balance. You get in fast, you do your damage, and get out before they can organize a response. All sides were doing this to some degree, and the Canadians, for example, became particularly good at it, and turned the whole thing into a systematic art. But what made the German approach different was that the Germans were willing to take the whole concept much, much further. They formalized it into dedicated, specialized units, with purpose-built tactics, custom equipment, and rigorous training programs, and eventually built an entirely new way of fighting. And one of the first and most important factors is that the German army trusted their junior officers and NCOs with independent decision-making, much more than the other armies did. And also, Germany was fighting on two fronts, with much fewer total resources than all of its enemies combined. So they just had to find ways to do more with less, so to speak, to make up for being outmatched in raw numbers. Now, the first thread of what would eventually become the Stormtrooper story actually started with fire. Bernhard Redemann was a reserve officer whose peacetime job was, of all things, being a fire chief, and he'd been fascinated for a while with the idea of using incendiary weapons in combat, which is strange for a man who was supposed to be putting fires out, but anyway. He put together a specialized unit of 48 pioneers, ironically, most of them being former firefighters, because they already knew how to work with hoses and pressurized tanks. Just now, instead of putting out fires, they'd be spraying fire on other people. Redemann is actually the guy who coined the term Stoßtrupp, which means shock troop. And they quickly proved that a small group of highly trained specialists carrying a literal terror weapon could actually crack open positions that a massed conventional attack simply could not. The unit had two types of flamethrower. The man-portable one, the Kleinflammenwerfer, was operated by a two-man crew and could throw a stream of burning fuel out at roughly 18 to 35 meters, depending on the model. Then you had the heavier Großflammenwerfer that could reach about 40 meters, but that one was static and had to be set up in the forward trench or a prepared position out in no man's land. But what does this have to do with the Stormtroopers? Well, because these guys had proven that their way of doing things actually worked, and that got people thinking about trying the same concept, but with a dedicated fighting force. Then, the second thread of the Stormtrooper story actually started as a failure. The German War Ministry formed a dedicated experimental assault unit, 649 men. And they'd had some success using portable steel shields to protect themselves while advancing towards enemy positions in mountainous terrain. These guys were kitted out with Sappenpanzer body armor, breastplates, portable steel shields, and experimental steel helmets, predecessors of the Stahlhelm that would later become standard across the entire German army. So the idea at first was a slow advance under the protection of all of this body armor. But before the unit could even be properly tested in the role it was designed for, a heavy French attack hammered the German lines, and the unit was pulled in as emergency defensive reinforcements. They were thrown in to plug gaps in the defensive line, and they got obliterated. Casualties exceeded 50%, so the experiment looked like it was a failure. And in its immediate form, yeah, it pretty much was. But the idea underneath was sound. What they needed was a different kind of leader. And that leader was Captain Willy Rohr. This guy had been in the military cadet system since the age of 10, so the army and fighting were pretty much his entire life. Just before the war started, he'd gone into the Premier Jäger unit, which literally means hunter unit, and these were a completely different breed from regular infantry. They wore camouflaged and darker uniforms before anyone else ever did. They operated in smaller and more flexible formations, with way more autonomy than the regular infantry ever had. Their whole approach was about fighting smart in difficult terrain, which is exactly what was now desperately required for trench warfare. So, to make a long story short, Rohr took command of the battered remnants of that special unit with body armor. And then he threw all of it out. He knew that speed was better protection than armor, so Rohr stripped away everything that slowed his men down. He kept only the new model Stahlhelm. He reorganized his whole force around small, flexible squads of roughly 8 men plus an NCO. Each squad was designed to be a self-contained, combined arms team that could make their own decisions in the chaos of a trench assault. He added a machine gun platoon for fire support, and he brought in a flamethrower platoon from Regiment Specialist Troops, and added a mortar detachment for close-range indirect fire. The weapons his men carried were chosen specifically for close, violent, and fast combat. Rohr replaced the full-length Gewehr 98 with a Carabiner 98AZ, a shorter carbine version designed for cavalry. Hand grenades became the primary weapon, carried in canvas bags slung across shoulders. Every single detail of personal equipment was rethought. Jackboots got swapped out for lighter and quieter Austrian mountain boots, and leather patches were sewn into knees and elbows for crawling and so on. And then, Rohr's collaboration with Redeman was the moment it all came together. Working together over just a few weeks, these two developed what became known as the Assault Squad concept. The flamethrower operators would go in first, and the infantry squads followed right behind them, entering the enemy trench on the heels of the flames and clearing each section with grenades. But before you hear what happened when this was tried out in practice for the first time, take a look at what it would take for you to become a Stormtrooper. Early in the war, honestly, quite a lot, because the selection was pretty demanding and strict. First of all, you had to be a volunteer. You had to be more than physically fit, unmarried, and under 25 years old. Now, maybe being unmarried is a criterion that sounds a bit off to you. Well, they knew that these guys were going on the most dangerous missions there were. So at the very least, they wanted them to not leave widows and orphans behind. Or, they just wanted to make them more willing to sacrifice their lives for the homeland, and all that propaganda that millions of soldiers died for. Your ability to handle aggression, to think under extreme pressure, and your absolute willingness to die was some of the traits that would make you a good Stormtrooper. Men with proven combat records in the form of the Iron Cross and experienced NCOs were the most valued candidates. But as you're about to hear, when the war dragged on, these requirements went lower and lower, until regular recruits were going into Stormtrooper units that were at that point pretty much working like kamikaze. Anyway, these guys were preparing in full-scale replica trench systems, built to give them conditions as close as humanly possible to real combat, and what they'd actually be facing on their assignments. They exercised with live ammunition, rehearsed their specific missions under aerial photographs, and tried to simulate exactly the position they'd be attacking, going over the plan again and again and again. This level of targeted preparation was pretty much unheard of for regular infantry, who typically received little more than a general briefing and a pointing of the arm towards the enemy line. These guys were learning everything, from how the operation should unfold to fighting with all sorts of different weapons, including, of course, enemy captured ones and hand-to-hand combat, since it would almost inevitably probably come to that. However, the most interesting thing, if you ask me, is that each soldier, besides being trained to work with any weapon he might come across, was also prepared to do the job of the man above him. The thing that stalled most of the attacks on the Western Front was the loss of a key leader, which usually paralyzed the entire unit. Well, Stormtroopers knew that their leaders were more likely to get killed, given the nature of the job. So everyone, and I mean everyone, was ready to step up and lead, if needed, either for himself or for the few guys of his team that were still alive. And this was something completely new, at a time when the average soldier was expected to do nothing until he received orders. Stormtroopers had a chain of command, so if, or better said when, one got killed, the next one took over immediately, without losing the momentum of the attack for a single second. And just so you see the difference, the British and French operated under detailed command from above, so everything was meticulously planned at headquarters miles behind the front, by officers who didn't even know what the ground they'd be fighting over actually looked like. Timetables were fixed to the minute, and each unit was assigned a specific objective with predetermined routes and strict timing, with little to no room for deviation. So when the real attack began, the plan was never going the way they wanted. It's a war after all, and yet there was no room to adapt along the way. That's why so many operations that were planned for months failed time and time again. So now you see why the Stormtrooper tactics were simply revolutionary. But they also got the best available weapons and equipment. Besides the flamethrowers and hand grenades, they got the Large Pistol 08, better known as the Artillery Luger. It was a longer-barreled version of the pistol originally designed for artillery crews, so they wouldn't have to carry full-sized rifles. But it came in quite handy for the close-quarters combat the Stormtroopers were about to get into. The snail drum magazine gave them 32 rounds of 9mm in semi-auto, so it was a much better tool for trench fighting than a rifle. But the Germans wouldn't stop there. Because they saw how effective such a weapon could be, they created the first ever submachine gun, the MP-18. The MP stands for Machine Pistol in German, while the submachine gun name actually came from the Americans when they were looking for a cool name for their Thompson, which wasn't a real machine gun, but, a submachine gun. Just a little fun fact. Okay, now with all seriousness, Stormtroopers had a fully automatic 9mm to sweep the trenches with, although production was slow and the gun came quite late, so they couldn't arm all of the Stormtroopers. And of course, for the scariest part of the job, there was hand-to-hand fighting, for which Stormtroopers carried all sorts of things, ranging from the trench knife to medieval melee weapons. Sharpened entrenching tools, improvised clubs with spikes, axes, hatchets, you name it, they have it. Stormtroopers usually crafted whatever they personally preferred. These were always reliable, quiet if used carefully to take out a sentry, and they never ran out of ammunition. But being the guy who actually had to use these things in real combat was, well, not really the most stress-free job I could think of. Stormtroopers also like to use enemy arms they'd pick up, and like I said earlier, they actually trained on them. The idea was that when they took a trench section and had to push further but they'd spent their ammo, they wouldn't need to wait for a resupply. They could grab whatever the soldiers they'd just killed or captured had been carrying and press on. But they also took some effective allied weapons, like any Lewis machine gun they could get their hands on, and they even rechambered them in German caliber, since the Lewis was much lighter than the MG08-15. And that gun was specifically designed for Stormtroopers as a lighter variant of the standard water-cooled MG08, but it didn't really shed that much weight to be useful in their kind of fast-moving tactics. There were also light mortars to fill the gap between the hand grenades and the artillery that was too heavy to carry with the assault. So Stormtroopers combined all of these weapons and roles within an assault group that made up of usually 8 to 10 men. You'd have grenadiers, 1 or 2 guys with a light machine gun or a machine pistol, and possibly a flamethrower team. Then a combat engineer with wire cutters and explosives for clearing obstacles, and Stormtroopers with those shortened rifles supporting each of these specialized roles. That was it. They carried enough weapons and ammo for short, intense bursts of violence, but not the standard 60-pound infantry kit that would slow them down. And depending on the specifics of each mission, these teams could be reorganized on the fly. No other nation pushed this idea as far as the Germans truly did. But now it was time to try all of this out in real combat. The Stormtrooper mission actually began days before the action itself. They would be transported to the front line as close as possible by truck, so they'd conserve their energy. From there, they would make a reconnaissance of the area, studying the enemy positions they were about to assault to identify the weak spots and refine the plan. Once they had everything locked in, it was time for the artillery preparation, which was also nothing like the standard prolonged bombardment. Instead of telegraphing the attack with days of shelling, it was short and overwhelmingly intense, carefully targeted at specific points of the sector being attacked. This was the work of George Bruchmüller, an artillery officer who developed the Feuerwalz system, literally meaning fire waltz, where the barrage was split into 3 short and violent phases. First, they hit the headquarters, telephone positions, and communication lines with a mix of high explosive and gas shells. The second phase shifted fire onto the enemy's gun batteries, mostly with gas, to prevent them from firing on the advancing stormtroopers. And the third phase directed fire onto the infantry lines in the front trenches, to suppress the defenders just before the assault, while the other batteries were hitting the rear areas to stop reinforcements from coming forward. The entire thing lasted a few hours at most, so the enemy wouldn't have time to prepare like they did when they had a week-long bombardment telling them exactly what was coming. And the most important last element of this system was the creeping barrage itself, which you've probably heard about. It was a precisely timed curtain of fire that advanced ahead of the infantry at a preset rate, for example 200 meters every 4 minutes. The infantry followed as closely behind this curtain as they possibly could, hopefully without getting killed by it. Which was, by the way, quite a challenge, because if anything went slightly wrong, they'd be hit by literally their own shells. And unsurprisingly, this did happen quite often. A faulty shell might fall short, one of the gun crews could get the calculations slightly off, or the infantry might advance too far too quickly. And to make this even worse, gas shells were used in most Stormtrooper actions, so they had to run across no man's land and fight wearing gas masks, which was also a really fun thing to do. So the whole purpose of all of this was for the infantry to arrive as closely as possible to the enemy trench, right when the barrage lifted. Just as the defenders began to run out of their dugouts, the stormtroopers would fire the flamethrowers, throw grenades, and jump on their heads to finish the survivors before they had any idea of what was going on. They'd then press on the weak spots in the defense, bypassing the strong points if they couldn't destroy them. The regular infantry would follow behind and hold the ground the stormtroopers had just captured, and then surround and deal with the individual strong points still standing. The stormtroopers themselves were always ordered to keep pushing as far as they could, which was another part of the risk, because if something happened, even after they successfully captured the position, they'd be cut off from their own lines. Stormtroopers also tried to make as much use as possible of darkness, fog, or rain, attacking when the defenders least expected it, or simply couldn't see the dark shapes creeping towards them. So instead of the artillery barrage, they'd be crawling through no man's land in absolute silence for hours, inch by inch, towards the opposing trench. One mistake, someone tripping over the wire or a sneeze, and the other side fires a flare and the whole assault force is exposed out in the open. That was pretty much the end of it. At least half of them weren't coming back after being compromised like that. But if they reached the lines still in one piece, then they had to silently eliminate the sentry in front of the main trench. And this is really one of the things that's much easier said than done. The sentry could make just one scream and alert the defenders, and again, the whole thing is over. But if they somehow took out the sentry, they were ready to storm the main trench. Grenades went in first, and as soon as they detonated, the stormtroopers jumped in and finished the job. Every squad went after its designated section, doing what they came to do. When the German offensive at Verdun opened on February 21st, 1916, stormtroopers were in the first wave. The assault was the largest German operation since the start of the war, and the method worked exactly as designed against the first line of defenses, with speed, surprise, and overwhelming the positions. The most dramatic single event of the offensive's opening days was the capture of Fort Douaumont, the biggest and highest in the ring of 19 major forts protecting the city. The French had left it barely manned and armed, and the Germans immediately exploited that. Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunz, a 24-year-old leading a squad of about 10 combat engineers, came up to the fort, and after realizing that no one was firing at them, he came closer and found the entrance. His own men refused to follow him inside, but he went in anyway, alone with his bolt-action rifle, and wandered through the corridors alone. He came across the gun crew inside, captured them, locked them in a room, and kept exploring. He then stumbled across a mess hall with food still on the table, and after a rough day, he stopped to grab something to eat. Later, a second group of about 20 men made their way in through a shell crater and captured the rest of the French defenders, taking the place without a single shot fired. But besides Fort Douaumont, Stormtroopers carried out some 70 missions during the Battle of Verdun, and they more than convinced the German High Command that the concept needed to be expanded further, and might even be a way to actually win this horrible, horrible war. And you're going to hear how, with this belief, the Germans gambled everything on the very last Stormtrooper mission. So, Stormtrooper units and training spread rapidly, and they took the best men from regular units to fill their ranks. This actually backfired for the rest of the German army, because it got hollowed out from the inside, as their finest soldiers were all pulled away, which then seriously reduced its overall fighting capability. Between missions, the Stormtroopers lived a quite different life from the regular infantry soldier around them, and that was actually another reason soldiers volunteered in the first place. They had better rations, tobacco and alcohol, and they were housed in rear area billets, in actual buildings rather than trenches or tents. They had more leave days, and they didn't perform the standard grinding duty of regular infantrymen, who very much envied them for all of it. But all of this was well earned in blood and missions that were more likely to fail than succeed. Here we have the Stormtroopers' most spectacular achievement, when they opened the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917. It was on the Italian front that had been static for over 2 years. But with the Russian army no longer a problem in the east, the Germans agreed to help the Austrian divisions there and send in their very best men to solve the situation. The sector chosen was the quietest one, where the defenders would least expect a strike. The well-prepared assault opened at 2 in the morning, in rain and extremely low clouds, with that rapid, concentrated 3-phase bombardment we explained earlier. A heavy barrage of gas shells loaded with chlorine and phosgene was fired into the valley trenches, and many of the Italian soldiers didn't even have proper gas masks, so the effect was just horrifying. At 8 in the morning, they also detonated 2 large mines under the strongpoints on the heights, and finally the infantry assault began, with the best troops, of course, going in first. They infiltrated through the gaps in the line in small groups and pushed deep into the rear. The Italian Second Army was simply disintegrated. They weren't ready for this kind of attack, and they were surrendering by the thousands. Some units advanced as far as 15 miles on the first day. The Italians lost 10,000 soldiers killed, 30,000 wounded, and 260,000 taken prisoner. And among the Stormtroopers in this mission, there was one guy that would become much better known in the next World War, Erwin Rommel. Yes, he was a Stormtrooper before the Second World War, and he would later apply what he learned here to his aggressive tactics, just with tanks and on a much larger scale. Then, 6 weeks after Caporetto on the Western Front, the British attacked with almost 500 tanks, and for the first time, no preliminary shelling, completely shocking the Germans. They overran the trenches and broke the lines in several places, advancing up to 5 miles on the first day. It looked like the British had found the key to the deadlock of trench warfare. Until the Stormtroopers arrived 10 days later and counterattacked. In their signature style, after that sharp, violent bombardment, Stormtroopers went in first and hit the British from the most unexpected directions possible, taking back all the ground they had gained previously. They destroyed some 40 tanks, improvising along the way with bundles of grenades or using artillery pieces to fire directly at them at close range. It seemed like the Stormtroopers were pretty much unstoppable. But now, the stage was set for their final show, which would also be the very end of the war, incidentally, and of Stormtroopers themselves. By the beginning of 1918, Germany formally ended the fighting with Russia in the east, and they freed up some 50 divisions, almost 500,000 men, to transfer to the Western Front. For the first time since 1914, they were in greater numbers than the Allies. But this window was not going to last, as the United States was putting in some 250,000 soldiers per month, and everything was being prepared for a spring that would perhaps decide the outcome of the war. The British naval blockade had strangled Germany, literally, into starvation, both on the front and among the civilians at home. The Germans knew that they weren't going to last much longer if something didn't change. If the Stormtroopers could break the Allied line and force a decision before American strength became overwhelming, Germany may survive. But if they could not, nothing else would matter. Everything the entire war had built towards was being loaded onto the shoulders of these men. So they got the idea to smash through the Allied lines at the junction between the British and French armies and separate them, which would theoretically knock the British out of the war. There was no actual plan for what would happen after that, but the situation was already desperate enough. So 63 German divisions were concentrated against 26 British along a 50-mile front. Artillery was massed like never before, with some 10,000 divisions of various calibers. The Feuerwolf system was scaled up to a level that had never been attempted before. It was now or never. The infantry was divided into attack and trench-holding units, meaning one would punch through the advance while the other defended and gained ground. And guess who was going in first? As always. All the best men from each division were taken to spearhead the assault. At 4:40 in the morning, on March 21st, 1918, the guns opened fire. In just 5 hours, they fired over 3.5 million shells, making this the heaviest bombardment in the history of warfare. Gas, high explosive, shrapnel, all of it raining down on the British positions across a front of just 150 square miles. At 9:30 in the morning, the Stormtroopers went forward through the dense fog, moving exactly as they were trained. British soldiers that survived on the barrage were stunned when they saw Germans emerging from all sides out of that fog. On the first day alone, over 20,000 British soldiers were taken prisoner. The front had been penetrated, something that hadn't happened once in the entire war. But the German casualties were also severe. Some 40,000, with the Stormtroopers taking the worst of it. Over the next few days, the advance went deeper, up to 40 miles in some places. It really seemed like they had actually done it, but then it all fell apart. And for quite a weird reason, actually. Stormtroopers had been fighting for days straight. They had no food, no water with them, and the supplies had to reach them over the land that had been completely devastated by their own massive bombardment. They were starving. After eating the horses, they went looking for supplies, and they found them. They went through the towns, found British supply depots, and captured things they hadn't seen for months or even years because of that naval blockade. White bread, tinned meat, chocolate, tobacco and alcohol in huge amounts. You really can't blame them for stopping after such horrors to have a well-earned break. Even officers couldn't stop their men. They got drunk and reckless, and the advance completely stalled. But unlike every previous operation where the Stormtroopers did their part of the job and were then pulled out, this time was different. They weren't withdrawn after the initial break in the line. Command kept them in continuous action for weeks upon weeks without relief or even rest, pushing them further and further to exploit the gains. Until they were completely spent. Pretty soon after that, the entire Stormtrooper branch was combat ineffective. And to make matters even worse for Germany, these men couldn't be replaced at this point. The most elite, highly trained soldiers that took months to gather and prepare were gone, and there was simply no one that could take their place. The ranks were filled with regular conscripts who pretty much knew the war was over by this point and not in their favour. They were deserting and surrendering at the first sign of opportunity. Amiens was the one objective whose capture could have severed British supply lines and perhaps pushed them out of the war. The supplies stored there, which Germany desperately needed, could have fallen into their hands, but it was never taken. The Germans came within 5 miles of it and was stopped, and each offensive met the same dead end after a spectacular start. It was over. Germany's total losses across all 5 spring offenses exceeded 680,000 men, and the Stormtrooper casualties were pretty much 100%. They had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Allies counterattacked, and that was, in short, it. But the whole idea of Stormtroopers is still very much alive today, because ever since they first appeared, no one has forgotten how effective they really were. Small, highly trained, and incredibly brave teams of special soldiers carried on through the wars that followed. And we still have Stormtroopers to this day. They're just called SAS, Navy SEALs, and so on. And they're working on the exact same principles, just with the fancy modern gadgets that German World War I Stormtroopers couldn't have even dreamed of.